Coogs House. All right, are you ready for the most biased NCAA bracket you've ever heard of?
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Angel, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who can't stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way you get the latest in your Cougs in your news feed each and every day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. Welcome back to the YouTube channel. It's good to see you again. Remember, we're approaching 1,000 subscribers. We're going to do a big giveaway when we get there. So to be entered, you got to be liking and commenting on the videos. You got to hit subscribe to make sure we get there. If you have nothing else to say after reading how biased this bracket I'm about to read you is that of my own making, tell us who you have winning. Tell us who you have you going across the boards. Obviously, we know you have the Cougs at the end, but like along the way. All right, so the schedule for today's episode is we're going to look at kind of some misnomers that upset me about the bracketology kind of aspect of some things. People really upset Houston is the number 1 overall seed, and that doesn't make any sense to me. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But also in the second and third segments, we're going to break down a bracket that is looking at what would the best scenario be for Houston, right? That's the scheme. That's the memo, right? It's just what would the bracket look like if you're filling it out in a way that best served the Houston Cougars, right? We'll get to more on that in a moment. But first, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And let's talk a little bit about how Houston got to where they are. Houston is the number 1 seed, right? That means that Alabama is the number 1 overall seed. They got to pick where they wanted to go first. And then the S-curve brought to Houston, and they chose the Midwest bracket because there's no bracket any closer to Houston, and so that's where they went, right? A lot of people upset about Kansas not getting the number 1 overall seed because they had more quad 1 wins. No one's talked about how they had more quad 1 losses as well. This may be something just kind of overlooked because they just played a lot more quad 1 and 2 teams. And so it's like, oh, well, they had a lot more quad 1 and 2 wins. Well, yeah, they just had more. I think the thing that perplexes me about this is in filling out the bracket, you'll see a lot of familiar names. Houston played 9 games this season against tournament teams, 6 of which were in the pre-conference play. Then they obviously played Memphis 3 times in total. And in looking at that, what's interesting to me is that's actually relatively comparable to all of the top dogs in any conference, anything that came out, right? Frankly, when you also factor in their preseason scrimmaging stuff, like Kelvin Sampson very much talked about the learning things they did in scrimmaging Duke and Texas, and scrimmaging Duke and UT Austin was a big moment for this program as far as like getting the young freshmen up to snuff and so da-da-da-da-da. But also, those teams are tournament teams as well. This team has seen and competed and beat tournament teams throughout the entire season and beaten them handily, right? KenPom has Houston as the number 1 team in every analytical metric. They also have Houston, as far as the strength of schedule goes, as fairly at least middle of the pack, if not in the top third of college basketball. And so I don't know. I feel like a lot of this things people like throw out about Houston are like looking at the schedule and just saying names that they don't necessarily think of, when the truth is like this schedule could have only been better had other teams fulfilled their end of the deal. Like Cincinnati finished at 54th in KenPom, and I'll tell you right now, that's a disappointing season for the Bearcats. They're looking at like, if they're going to move in the Big 12, what are they going to do, right? They realistically could have been a third American Athletic Conference team in had they not had some slip-ups early, right? Similarly, UCF also moving into the Big 12 next season, finished at 65th in KenPom, but they have a like one-and-done lottery pick kind of guy in Taylor Hendricks, and KenPom has them at 65. But had they like handled their business as well, they could have been like, it's not Houston's fault those other schools did not handle theirs. The one that sticks out the most, though, is Oregon. Had Houston scheduled that Oregon game at Oregon, beat them by 10 points early this season, and frankly, had Oregon had a better year, right? They finished at 41st in KenPom, kind of had a dismal performance in the towards the latter half of the season in the Pac-12, lost 3 in a row in the middle of it, middle of February, and then lost in the second round to UCLA in the Pac-12 tournament. You know, that if they'd played better, would have helped them out, but also would have made that win on the road early in the season against a team with 5-star recruits, against a team with a big-time program, against a team with a big-time, all the things, right? That would have been a big moment for Houston as well. The big knock being like, they don't play anybody seems silly when Oregon was supposed to be somebody, right? Cincinnati is kind of supposed to be somebody most years. There's been years Wichita State is a somebody. It's not Houston's fault that those teams are not somebodies. But for comparison, I mentioned Houston played 9 teams against tournament teams, or 9 games against tournament teams, I'm sorry. Number 2 seeds, UCLA and Arizona in the Pac-12, only played 10 each. Right? So like their schedules are actually fairly comparable. It's not any better to play a name brand bad team than a not name brand bad team. You're still playing a bad basketball team. And so you like look at like a conference put out 2 number 2 seeds in UCLA and Oregon. And you're like, oh man, like the Pac-12 clearly is a much more difficult path than the American Athletic Conference, all those kinds of things. But that's just not the case. Those team schedules were, if anything, based on, I mean, they didn't play Alabama. Right, they didn't play Virginia. Right, if anything, you could argue those schedules were easier because they got to play that Oregon team that Houston beat 2 or 3 times by the time the tournament's over. Right, so like all of a sudden, like, wait a second, Houston had as difficult a schedule as several of these teams in a lot of different ways. And I'm not saying they had like the Big 12 schedule that they played 20 plus quad 1 and 2 teams in. I get that that's not necessarily the same thing, but their win percentage in quad 1 and 2 games indicates that they probably would have been fine, because they won all but one of their quad 1 and 2 games in the regular season, and then the quad 1 and 2 loss that they added in the conference tournament. I think it's actually a quad 1 loss to Memphis in the conference tournament because of final rankings and so on, was without their best player, right? Like those things matter, and those things shape how this goes. And if anything is interesting to me is in reading and listening and hearing different members of the committee speak, talking about where people got seated. Houston got the benefit of the doubt in that Sasser's injury will heal. It sounds like he may even be 100% by Thursday. We'll see. I like the rest until Saturday. I digress. The more concerning thing as far as health goes for a lot of people making these selections, and they do take that into account, was Kansas's Bill Self had to step away from the team for his own health stuff, and that seems far more serious. And frankly, we saw that team get throttled by Texas twice in a week, with him and without him. And so it's like, okay, that's the thing that the committee chose to dwell on. That's the reason they went about it. And so in doing that, we're about to talk through the bracket. We're about to talk through a very biased look at what could happen in the best possible scenarios for Houston in said bracket. But I just feel like we got to point out, like, at the end of the day, Houston did very, very well with what they had. They can't control that, like, Tulane was not the national power or something like that. Like, that's not up to them. They play who they play, and they did very well across the board. Did they slip up once against Temple in January? Yes. Do you want me to start pulling up all the different times that different teams across the country slipped up? I'm like, do you want to go what UT Austin did to start the season? Do you want to do it like, can we look at what Kentucky started with at the start of the year? Like, how far back do you want to go to these blue bloods talking about who gets to slip up and when and how those things happen? I mean, Temple beat Rutgers. Rutgers beat Purdue. No one's complaining about Purdue being a number 1 overall seed, right? Anyway, I digress. That's my rant. That's my rave. We are going to talk about the bracket some. And again, a very, very biased look at ways that the bracket could actually be a workout in Houston's favor. Again, making some picks in that instance. But first, let's talk about our buddies at FanDuel. Now, FanDuel is America's number 1 sports book, and it's March. And it's the perfect time to download FanDuel because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. It's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Then you can get bet on everything from money line to point scores and 3-pointer strain. It's fast, safe, and super easy to use. And for the Houston Northern Kentucky game, they got Houston favored by 19.5 points, and the over-under set at 122.5. I think that over hits. I think it goes over that. I think it's more like a 75-50 kind of game. Doing quick math there, you're looking at more like 130. That's a comfortable enough cushion to me that you're looking at over 122.5. Admittedly, Northern Kentucky, they play with a slow pace. I will preview all of that tomorrow's episode, but they do play at a slow pace. So I can see how that pulls this down some. But Houston likes to speed teams up when they're on defense. So I think they're getting some transition turnovers and that kind of stuff and speed this up a little bit. Houston is favored by 19.5. Again, I do think they break that. I do think it'd be kind of thing where you could see Houston kind of have a 1 or 2 stories. They have a blitz in the first half, open up the game, and it's never close. that game they win by 25. I could see it being a 8-point game at halftime that Houston opens up right after half. I could see either one of those happening. But either way, I see this being a more than 20-point win for the Cougs, whether or not Sasser plays. Obviously, Sasser playing, if he is 100%, makes that go exponentially up. I'm telling you, do all those bets, place all those bets at FanDuel, and FanDuel will let you combine your bets for a bigger chance at a bigger payout with the same game parlay. Don't miss the chance to place your no sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet doesn't go right when you go to fanduel.com/lockedon. That's fanduel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more with FanDuel, official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so let's look at this bracket. Admittedly, I want to preview a couple things. One, I told you guys that the bracket I'm looking at here, I'm going to pick things that help the University of Houston. So I'm not even necessarily saying this is where I'd be putting my money, but I am saying that this is what I would like to see happen for the U of H. I think this is the way that things could work out for the U of H. So let's start with their bracket in the Midwest. Across the board here, I think a couple things happened. One, I picked Iowa to beat Auburn because I do think that's a clash of two styles. And I think that what you could see there happen is whichever style seems to edge the other out. I like what Iowa does. I think that that's more built to last in a lot of ways. I could see Iowa, frankly, if they weren't playing the Cougs in the next round, winning a couple games in this, but they're the 8 seed, the 9 seed, 8-9 game. So I think that Iowa's way winning out would be the best thing for the Cougs because obviously having to play Auburn in Birmingham is just not very like it's a glorified home game. It's less than 2 hours away. That's the way that goes. You don't want to risk those kinds of things, especially not knowing what Sasser's health is like. So that's my pick there. I do have Kent State winning their first round game, but I have Miami knocking them off. Miami is hurt, but also had a very, very deep run in the ACC. Almost at AAC. I think Miami's guard play is going to be crucial in the tournament. I also think Miami will probably look at that Houston-Kent State playbook as far as how things went for them. Not that Miami is as good as Houston, but they play fairly similarly as far as like how they're going to attack what Kent State does. And so that's what I see happening there. On the other side of the bracket, I have Iowa State getting all the way to Sweet 16. I do know Xavier is a good team, and I do know that Kennesaw State is one of like people are picking them as a common like upset rah-rah kind of thing. I think Iowa State as a Big 12 team is battle tested, and I would pick that to go a little bit farther. I also think it's worth pointing out that like Iowa State is always a sneaky like 5, 6, 7 seed in this tournament, and so I'm picking them to go on. My fun one I got here is something's upside down there. Oh, well, I got Texas A&M over the Texas Longhorns. Texas A&M is a high variance team. They play really, really high often. They play really, really low often. I feel like they're going to be up for the Texas game. I also feel like we don't know enough about how Terry does in coaching in these NCAA tournament games for UT Austin. Obviously, the big coaching turnover there is their story. If you go check out Locked On Longhorns, I'm sure they're breaking it down all year long. But I've got A&M over them there. I also then have A&M getting all the way to that Elite Eight because of those high variance kind of things. I could see them coming into the Sweet 16 strong. And then the reason I like them in a matchup with the Cougs is because, frankly, I haven't seen them play a little bit. I think Houston could do a decent job in slowing down Will Wade the fourth. I also think that what goes up must come down. If that roller coaster is going to go soaring high in those first couple of rounds, Houston may catch them feeling themselves a little bit. You also know Brandon Miller did a number on them when they played each other in the SEC tournament. Not in the first matchup in the regular season, but in the tournament they did. Houston can use Jarace Walker in a bunch of different similar ways. I also see the way that A&M kind of gave up like bled points to Bediako be the way Houston could feed Juwan Roberts. I think those kinds of things can happen there to me. And so that is why I'm picking A&M to go through. I think obviously that's like the best outcome for the Cougs. It's a fun rivalry, is an in-state thing and so on. But B, I think that's a good matchup for Houston. Now, the more common pick here would have Texas go through the Elite Eight and Texas UT Austin be the team that Houston plays. I don't think that's a bad matchup either. I think that they've got a little bit more depth than A&M does, but in the tournament that might not be as big of a deal. I think the deal that's interesting to me there is their guards are bigger, but probably not as good side to side and quick. And so Houston may have to like make sure they shoot the ball well in a matchup with Texas. But if Sasser's good to go, I think that's one that they'll be okay with. Either way, I think this is a fairly favorable region for Houston as far as getting to the Final Four goes, and I'm not too terribly worried if everyone is healthy, playing well, and shooting well. Do things happen? Yes, things absolutely happen. I'm not even sure that March Madness is necessarily the best way to pick the best team in college basketball every year. However, I'm not super concerned about this fourth of the bracket for Houston. It's a very, very good draw for what Houston has done, assuming that they don't have to play like Auburn in the state of Alabama or something like that crazy, right? All right, moving on to the West region. This is the one where Kansas is super upset about what did and didn't happen, all sorts of things. So let's see how this bracket could work out best for the U of H. You'll notice I have Arkansas getting all the way to the Elite Eight, and that does mean that I have them upsetting Kansas in the second round. I'm sorry. Now, Arkansas is extremely athletic and long, and frankly, I like the Anthony Black kid a lot for them. I can see him doing a number on Kansas. Kansas has been rolling out a lot this year with kind of an undersized front court, and Arkansas will match all of that speed and aggression from the get-go. I see Arkansas as a very underrated team. They came in as an 8 seed, and so I have them all the way to Elite 8 in this, and I'll get to why that works for Houston in a second. St. Mary's will represent Houston well. Houston beat them on a neutral floor, but also I think St. Mary's has the experienced veterans that we saw in that matchup back in, was that early December? Was that long ago? And I think that that'll work out well for them. On the other side of the bracket, you'll notice I have Arizona State. I marked them in the play-in game because I think they beat TCU because TCU will no longer have Eddie Lampkin. Obviously, shout out to Eddie. Come back to the H. Come play for Houston one day. But that's why I marked them in the play-in game as well. But they move on for one round before falling ultimately to Gonzaga. I think Gonzaga goes all the way through in this region. UCLA is strong but injured, and so that's why I think that Gonzaga comes out. The interesting matchup here that I think most people would not have, I think benefits Houston for a number of reasons, would have Gonzaga beating Arkansas, because Houston can deal with Gonzaga in different ways, but I don't think it's like impossible. I'm not just picking this out of like a straw hat. You have Drew Timme and the leadership he provides. Obviously, this is a team and program that has been to the finals before. They've done this March thing before. Arkansas rolls with 4 freshmen, right? Like that's a whole different kind of concept. Those 4 freshmen like are great, tremendous. You got a couple lottery picks in there. I get it, but Gonzaga has dealt with that before. You also have, a Gonzaga team that has kind of grown into its own. Julian Strawther, who is their own probable one and done first round pick on a guy in Gonzaga. The lone, like young and experienced starter, he will grow. He's grown up over the course of the season. And I think this will be kind of the moment where like you see this tournament could play out, the kind of moment where we see him turn into something kind of like we saw Jalen Suggs do with them a couple years ago, or Chet Holmgren do more recently. Like Gonzaga has a great way of molding or mixing these veteran teams and these underclassmen. And I could see the combination there being a lot for Arkansas. I also think, frankly, Gonzaga, I don't want to say they're deeper than Arkansas, but they certainly, like as far as like talent goes, I think Arkansas's like 10th man is probably better than Gonzaga's 10th man. I think the difference is that they use their depth, whereas Arkansas will be comfortable playing 7 guys. And by the time you get to the Elite 8, that seems to matter a lot more, right? And so I am not just picking Gonzaga because it helps Houston. I'm also picking Gonzaga because I think it's a real possibility. I'm not picking random things to help Houston, right? Because if that was the case, we'd have had Howard beat Kansas for the Jordan brand, right? I don't think that that's the best way to go about this, but I do see Gonzaga beating Arkansas in a way, and Arkansas beating Kansas in a way that actually ultimately helps Houston out. That said, if Kansas were to be the more popular pick in this bracket and come out of it, I'm not horribly worried about it. I will say that that's an athletic team that kind of matches Houston in aggression and intensity. They play a little undersized, which helps Houston out as opposed to some of the years in the past. They have like the traditional 4- and 5th-year starter big man. But I would be interested to see how the KJ Adams and Juwan Roberts matchup goes. Juwan's a little bit bigger. Adams a little bit quicker. I don't know who Kansas has that can cover Jarace Walker, but I do know that Houston would have its own trouble finding like can Tramon Mark cover Grady Dick, right? That's the matchup that turns into very, very quickly. All right. I want to talk a little bit about the East region. The East region is, I think, a little bit of a crapshoot. And so let's talk about my picks in the East region. You'll notice for the brand here, I am picking Memphis over Purdue. I see Purdue as the weakest number 1 seed. Not just because they're the fourth number one overall seed, but also because they play a brand of basketball that to me is not really built for March. Zach Edey is a beast. He's a pro. I'm not saying I'm kicking him out of my gym if he comes in. I am saying that big men have to have guards get him the ball. And I do think Purdue's guards, for the level of basketball that they're aspiring to play as a 1 seed, are a little weaker. I also think it helps Houston out in the long run because an eventual matchup with Purdue would be hard. They'd basically be hoping that they can get the ball out of the guards' hands before it gets down to Zach Edey, because Houston's got no one big enough to deal with Zach Edey in a pure size thing. And then you're just hoping like you don't foul all of your guys out, because Houston's got Juwan Roberts, they got Jarace Walker, Reggie Chaney, Javier Francis. However, if they're suddenly like foul, because you're trying to keep him from scoring, eventually you're like working yourself out of having any offensive rhythm, because they're also fairly integral to what you do on that end. Memphis, I do think, can realistically do this. I'm not just randomly picking them. Kendrick Davis kind of guy that can get hot. They got length, they got speed, and also that full court press they do will give Purdue's guards problems, right? It's not just me picking something to help Houston for the sake of helping Houston. This is a bigger picture here. I got Duke winning their first game over Oral Roberts. I really did think about having Oral Roberts go farther on that one, because there is always a 12 beats to 5, but Duke is hot at the right time, but not hot enough to get past Tennessee. I don't think Tennessee's defense slows them down. I think this is a realistic matchup that could happen, both in Tennessee moving on and in Duke and Tennessee meeting each other in the round of 32. I think the realistic possibility of Tennessee beating Duke, I like Julian Phillips on Kyle Filipowski. I think that's a matchup that Tennessee on a good day feels good about. I do see Zakai Ziegler as kind of an X factor for Tennessee. He's a 5'9" point guard. If he's having his way with Duke, I think that's a fairly simple game for Tennessee. If he's not, this could be a slugfest, mud fight, either way. I do see the winner of that game beating Memphis regardless. So I don't mean to say that like the matchup would flip a whole lot. I do see Memphis losing the Sweet 16 after whoever that is, because that's a tough matchup for them in the next round. As far as the other side of the bracket goes, I think Kentucky's hot at the right time, not hot enough to beat Kansas State. I think Marquette is a well-coached program right now. Shaka Smart's done a great job with that group. I got them moving on all the way. If you read that bracket, yes, that is correct, all the way to the Final Four. I think the deal there is when you get to them against like a Kansas State or a Tennessee, suddenly you're seeing the lack of Tennessee offense come into play some. Shaka's has settled in. He's got some efficient guards in Tyler Kolek and Cam Jones. I think those guys can handle Tennessee, and then guard play in the tournament is a big thing to me. That's also why I like Houston in this tournament. They dominated Big East play for the entirety of 2023. I don't see them slowing down now. And so that's who I have coming out of the East region. The more, I think, common pick, you see this is kind of a region where people will pick someone a little less spicy, or a little bit more spicy, I should say, and go with like a Kentucky going away as a 6 seed, a blue blood, but as a 6 seed, or Duke going away as a 5 seed because they got a little bit more hot there. I do think both those teams match up well with Houston. We heard in the reports about the preseason scrimmage that Houston kind of ran through Duke. I'm not worried about that matchup. Both teams have gotten better, obviously, but I think that was kind of a wake-up moment for them. I like every aspect of the Jarace Walker on Kyle Filipowski matchup. So if they want to get to the finals and play us there, we'll see you there. And Jarace will have 25 and 30 or whatever it is on his way out. That would be awesome too. I'm not worried about it. I don't know that that's how it shakes out. Kentucky is interesting because their guard is a kid I like a lot, Cason Wallace. Strong guard. Frankly, they also have Severe Wheeler backing up. Severe Wheeler is one of Houston's own, right? Cason didn't play a lot down the stretch at the end of the season with injuries and stuff like that. In that matchup, I would still obviously pick Houston's guards to play defense against those guards. But on the whole, I see Marquette as a realistic option that would help out Houston if they made it out of that region. And it's a region I could see a lot of different teams winning. For instance, I wouldn't be surprised to see Kansas State come out of it either, but I digress. All right, and the last region here gives the Alabama South region. Alabama is the number 1 overall seed. We know what they look like from being up close and personal with them in Houston. a couple months ago at this point. But I'm picking them to go all the way to the Elite Eight and stopping short there. I have them playing West Virginia. That could be a fun game. I think Alabama wins that one fairly handily. I got them playing Virginia in the Sweet 16. Virginia would have beaten San Diego State to get there. I like the matchup there a lot. I think Virginia will slow down Alabama a lot and make them shoot threes. I think that's an interesting way to go about playing Alabama. I do think at the end of the day, though, if we remember Virginia versus Houston, right? If I'm being realistic, I mean, I'd love to see Virginia win that game, shut up Alabama fans and so on. It's a team Houston knows they can beat as well moving on. So not that Houston can't beat Alabama. We probably should have beaten Alabama a couple months ago. We're up by 15 in the second half of the game. Don't get me so riled up. But in looking at this one in particular, I'm going to go with Alabama beating Virginia because you remember how Virginia played Jarace in that game, right? Frankly, Jarace had a field day as a creator. Brandon Miller is a good creator as well. I like Jarace as a passer more. He just doesn't get to do it as often because the offense Houston runs, but when he does it, it's special, man. That said, Alabama will probably put on the tape and watch Jarace do that. I'm like, oh, we have a guy that can do the same kind of stuff, and that's how that happens. I have Arizona winning a couple games of this, but running into the same Stonewall with Baylor, and then I have Utah State and Creighton each winning a game. I have Baylor winning the region, though, for a number of reasons. I do think Baylor and Alabama is a fun matchup, and I do think Houston matches up well enough to beat both teams. Again, I mentioned I think Houston should have beat Alabama the first time. Frankly, they're up 15, and then some chaos happened when Alabama kind of broke their own scouting report and put the bench in and did something completely different, right? We talked about that way back in the pod. Go back and check the catalog. It was a weird weekend. However, in looking at Baylor beating them, I think the difference here comes down to guard play. Does Brandon Miller win his matchup against Julian Bridges, whoever? Almost definitely, right? I think Flothamba and Bediako is a fun matchup. So Bediako is probably a little longer and more lean, but Flothamba is a little bit bigger and sturdier. Fun, pick your difference, pick your battles. The deal here to me is that Keontae George and the guard play for Baylor is so much better than everything I've seen out of Alabama's guard play. I'm not saying like Mark Sears can't shoot and that kind of stuff, but the creativity and like production out of Keontae George is so much stronger to me. Again, I'm not worried about either one of these guys as far as matching with Houston. So it really came down to like, well, who do you think is actually going to win? And I think Baylor should win this matchup, actually. I know that they had some learning to do early in the season and didn't have like the win-loss record that would put them on a one line like others did. But Baylor's really, really strong to me. I kind of turned it around earlier, like some point in mid-January. It's a whole lot different team now than they would have been earlier. That leads to my final four, looking like Gonzaga, Houston on the right side of the bracket, and then you have Baylor and Marquette on the left side of the bracket. And I'm picking Houston, obviously, all the way through, but I'm picking them to beat Baylor in the final. Now, I actually think here Houston beats Marquette or Baylor. I don't mean to say that they won't, but I do think what's interesting in pointing this out is you then have a young one-and-done freshman guard at Baylor and Keontae George, and a one-and-done young, all-around, I don't know what you want to call Jarace Walker forward coming across for Houston. I think the interesting thing there comes down to veteran leadership and having Marcus Sasser having been to a Final Four before, right? Having Jamal Shead having been to the Elite Eight before, right? Having these guys that while Houston does feel like a young team because of injuries in the last couple of years, they also have guys on their team that have been to these deep runs before. It is an all-Texas final, and that may be part of my Texan soul picking that as well. But I think Houston beats Baylor in that game if that works out. I do think this is a fairly favorable Final Four for the U of H. And I do think, frankly, that it's the kind of thing that we should be rooting for, because that could spur this whole secondhand rivalry that happens as Houston moves into the Big 12 next season, right? How much more fun could it be to go into the Big 12 next season, not only coming off the heels of an NCAA championship, but having just played your in-state Big 12 rival or soon-to-be rival on the way. I think that's a great way to go about it. Tell me what you think as far as a great Houston-based outcome for this would be. Obviously, I'm not even saying that's what my picks are on my ESPN bracket and my work pool. What I am saying is I think that's the way this thing shapes out well for Houston in a couple different ways. Interested to see what your thoughts are as well. Tell me what your bracketology brain is picking, tell me in the comments below. Thank you all so much for making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. We appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen each and every day for all things Houston Cougars. If you're looking for a second listen to the day, I'm going to tell you to go listen to Locked On College Basketball because they have a little bit less bias in what they're doing, and they may tell you something more neutral as far as what's going on in the tournament. And you can maybe compare and contrast. What do we do over here? What did they do over there, right? Thank you so much, Locked On Cougs. It's a proud member of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, or in our case, number one team in the country, and hopefully soon to be national champion every single day. Go Cougs.